Chapter 27. A dragon tries to introduce Jack and Jamie to religion. Jack's lower lip jutted slightly outward, but he didn't seem to notice it. Hiccup tried not to stare too much, his mind reeling to find some way to turn the conversation light again. He shouldn't have said anything, though he really didn't understand why Jack was so defensive of magic, even after Hiccup's somewhat rough introduction to it.
"You must have experienced something wonderful to love it so much,"
Hiccup mumbled, trying for a smile that probably came off as too apologetic. Jack pursed his lips and shrugged. "I guess," he said. "Some good, some bad. But my point is that it's not all bad. The Snow Queen is just giving it all a very bad reputation. It's really, really frustrating."
"You seem frustrated,"
Hiccup agreed, earning a raised brow from Jack. "Do I?" Hiccup was unsure if he was turning the conversation awkward again.
"Yeah, well, you have the right to be frustrated, of course," he quickly said. "Sounds to me like magic isn't as feared where you come from, and then to end up here."
Hiccup scratched his head, still lost on how that happened, aside from the fact that it was magic, which he also still had trouble believing, somehow. Jack sighed. "More like people don't know about it," he said. "They don't believe at all. Just the kids, usually. Jamie was—" He turned around and stopped in his tracks. Hiccup and Toothless stopped as well and followed his gaze. Where Jamie had been walking moments before was nothing at all. "Where?" Jack started, before jumping off the ground when Jamie's panicked voice shot through the air.
"Jack!"
Jack sat into his sprint.
"Jamie!"
he yelled back. Hiccup bolted after him, and Babytooth sped off through the air with a frantic squeaking, disappearing between the trees. The rest of them traced their steps back the way they'd come. Toothless made a growling noise and left the trodden path into the bushes towards the mountain wall. Hiccup followed to see him sniffing the ground. A couple of scales lay there, changing colors as he watched them. His stomach twisted.
"Jamie!"
he yelled, but got no answer. He picked up the scales and examined them more closely. He cursed inwardly. These woods were the perfect habitat for changelings. Why hadn't he paid more attention? He turned to Toothless.
"Can you track them?"
Toothless made a noise that sounded to Hiccup comfortingly determined. He patted Toothless's nose before heading back towards Jack's increasingly panicked calling.
"Jack, we found something."
Jack stumbled out of some bushes, his eyes wide. "What?" He came up to look at the scales, then up at Hiccup again. Is he okay?" Hiccup didn't have the heart to say he didn't know.
"I think he was taken by a dragon," he said. "A changeling. We've dealt with them before, and they're not necessarily aggressive."
Jack's face turned impossibly paler. "Necessarily," he repeated, but was starting to nod. He had a slightly wild look in his eyes, clearly struggling to keep his head cool, hanging on to every sliver of hope that Hiccup could give him.
"Toothless can track him,"
Hiccup said, and unthinkingly grabbed Jack's hand to squeeze it. Then he realized what he'd done and quickly let go to turn to Toothless instead.
"Let's go, bud," he said,
hoping his face hadn't revealed anything that shouldn't be revealed. As they got into the air, Jack started muttering to himself. The ferry wasn't nearby, so he didn't have that excuse anymore. Hiccup began to get the impression that Jack just had the habit of speaking to himself.
"Norse, please?"
Hiccup suggested. "He was right behind us," Jack said. I think he was." He thumped his head once against Hiccup's shoulder, cursing under his breath. "I'm supposed to be good at this."
"It's not your fault, Jack. I should have paid more attention," Hiccup said. "Changelings are fast and quiet. He could have been right behind us and still be snatched."
"But then we would have heard him right behind us," Jack argued, "and not several meters behind us."
"Not necessarily. Changeling tails are prehensile and can lift a grown person, or at least a fairly heavy, almost grown person like Snotlout, without a problem. It could have clamped Jamie's mouth shut, and he only got the chance to scream when—"
"Oh, gods, no," Jack murmured, his voice muffled. Hiccup imagined he was dragging his hand down his face.
"But they usually keep to themselves unless agitated, and I can't say Jamie's the most, aggressive type,"
he said, in an attempt to sound soothing. "What else could have been the reason, then?" Jack asked. "What are changelings like?" Hiccup clicked his tongue.
"Maybe this isn't the best time."
"Hiccup?"
"Okay, no, listen."
Hiccup turned halfway around, as Toothless seemed to be flying in a steady arch around the rocky hills with no problem on his own. He looked Jack in the eyes as he spoke.
"We've trained them before, and we've had several encounters with them. Fishsticks got very close to some wild ones, but they left him unharmed."
Jack looked unconvinced. "And what would have happened if they didn't?" Hiccup sent him a look that clearly asked, "Are you sure you want to hear that right now?" Jack's gaze remained steady.
"Okay,"
he sighed, wondering where it would be best to start. The best would probably be not to start at all, but it didn't seem that was an option.
Changelings have the ability to camouflage themselves, so they turn practically and completely invisible.
Oh, that, Jake started before shaking his head. Never mind, that's a joke for later. Go on. Hiccup blinked.
Okay, well, they're very fast and very quiet, and they're usually in packs. Instead of fire, they spew acid. They're mostly nocturnal, so it is a bit strange that this one was out at the time of day, but
he realized this was probably not the kind of dragon fact that was relevant right now. He cleared his throat.
And like I said, though they may be aggressive sometimes, some of them aren't that bad. They're very curious and like to copy things that are interesting or funny to them.
Jack, who had been looking more and more solemn as Hiccup continued speaking, tilted his head to the side. What would a dragon find fun? He asked.
Lots of things,
Hiccup said with a shrug.
Changelings are particularly fond of colors. They also like it when you mimic their noises or mannerisms.
Their noises? Can you mimic a changewing? Hiccup made an attempt, and if he felt ridiculous it was worth it when Jack burst out laughing, the worry lines in his face easing for a moment. Hiccup smiled sheepishly and turned ahead when his cheeks started to burn.
Fishsticks does it better, but hopefully that'll be enough to win it over, he said.
I'm sure it'll be very charmed, Jack snickered. They didn't have to fly long before Toothless's ears started twitching. They'd gotten to a part of the hills with taller and more jagged rocks, offering many corners and nooks to hide in, or for enemies to hide in and ambush them, but Hiccup tried to stay positive. They soared over the landscape, which seemed empty of all life, until they spotted the nest. A bright red changewing coiled around a clutch of glowing, colorful eggs, and Jamie. It was a single nest, and Hiccup couldn't spot any other changewings nearby. Did that mean this one was alone? Jack's voice broke a little in relief when he spotted him. He's alive. Is he hurt?
I can't tell from here, Hiccup replied in a murmur. We need to be quiet. The fastest way would be to just swoop in and grab him without getting noticed.
He paused as they continued to circle overhead.
I don't think he's hurt, though.
Why? He smiled wryly.
Changelings are very paternal. Something happened with Snotlout at one point. I think she sort of adopted him.
Jack was quiet for a bit. Hiccup could feel him shaking behind him, clearly struggling to contain a laughing fit. So, what do we do? He asked, once he managed to swallow his amusement.
Same strategy. As it is, she might even be more dangerous to us, as she's protecting her young.
Jack huffed. This is unfair. I was protecting him first. Hiccup smiled and patted Jack's knee.
We'll get him back. At least this means she won't hurt him in any way.
Of course, the strategy went to hell immediately. Toothless swooped down behind the changewing, but when Jamie spotted them, he must have made a sound that alerted the changewing to their presence. The changewing whipped its head around and hissed at them, curling closer around her eggs and Jamie. At least she didn't try to camouflage herself. It would have done no good, because she couldn't move away from her eggs anyway. Toothless swerved to avoid a spray of acid, and they were forced to fall back. They took cover in one of the nooks Hiccup had been so worried about earlier.
Okay, new plan, Hiccup said. Changewings aren't untrainable. We can try to befriend her, maybe.
Jack bit his lip. I like your pacifism, but are you sure that's the best approach right now?
No,
Hiccup admitted.
Worth a try, though. I think we better approach it without Toothless, though.
Even better, Jack muttered, exchanging an empathetic look with Toothless, who also didn't look particularly fond of that idea. Hiccup hopped off the saddle and put a hand under Toothless's mouth.
Just stay close. She might feel less threatened if we come without you. Jack, why are you taking your shoes off?
Jack froze in the action and didn't seem to be bothered at all by standing only on one leg. His balance was impeccable. I can't move as fast with these bricks on my feet, he complained.
Right, okay, Hiccup said, fighting off a smile. Just stay close to me. If I tell you to run, you run.
Jack hummed. You're the expert, he said, and Hiccup easily recognized it as a way to avoid making any promises. But he decided not to press him. As planned, Hiccup led the way with Jack at his side, and Toothless close behind them, but far enough away that the changewing wouldn't immediately spot him. If something went wrong, which was expected, he could hopefully intervene in time. Hiccup peeked out from behind a boulder. The changewing noticed him instantly, and he quickly leaned back, almost crashing into Jack.
All right. Stay here for a moment.
What? Jack said. No, why?
Because if it's just one of us, then she'll feel less threatened, Hiccup said. Trust me, I know what I'm doing. At least, somewhat.
Jack narrowed his eyes. "And you call me reckless?"
"You are reckless."
"You're reckless, sir," Jack insisted. "At least I jump into stuff without planning beforehand. You plan beforehand and know what a bad idea it is, and then still do it." Hiccup stared at him. The fact that he had a point was extremely annoying.
"Well, it's my stupid plan, so I make the rules," he said. "Stay here. Toothless is around here somewhere. He'll jump in if something goes wrong."
Jack didn't look happy about that. In fact, he had the face of someone who wanted to not do what he was told, just in the name of not doing what one was told. Hiccup hoped Jamie's safety was enough to keep him in place. Hiccup peeked around the corner again.
"Don't worry,"
he said softly, keeping his head down and his empty palms exposed. The changeling eyed him with hostility, and Hiccup waited before taking another step forward.
"It's okay. We're not trying to hurt you or your eggs."
Jamie's eyes were wide. He was partially obscured by the dragon, who had placed herself in front of him and her eggs. Hiccup realized how stupid this plan really was, but he didn't like the idea of not even trying to do this the right way, the pacifist way, as Jack put it. But Toothless had his back, and the changeling wouldn't hurt Jamie. This was fine.
"We just wanna,
kidnap your adoptive child?"
"Hang out?"
The changeling growled. She didn't attack, but it still didn't feel like Hiccup was getting anywhere. He dared take another step forward, and the dragon started to bare her teeth. He stopped and tentatively reached out with his hand.
"Hiccup!"
came Jamie's small voice. Hiccup looked up at him, and then saw something horrible. Jack was sneaking up behind the changeling. How did he even get there? Hiccup looked away before either Jamie or the changeling realized something was up.
Just hi,"
he stammered, just to get the dragon's attention. In the corner of his eyes, he saw Jack give him a thumbs up. Hiccup swallowed down his fury.
"My name is Hiccup. Do you have a name?"
Jamie frowned in confusion.
"Of course you don't. Well, let's give you a name,"
Hiccup continued with a nervous laugh.
"How about son of a half-troll?"
The changeling had spotted Jack.
"Jack, run!"
Hiccup yelled and ran at the dragon in a desperate attempt to draw her attention away. It didn't work. The changeling puffed herself up and let out a thick spray of acid, and Jack's reflexes were too slow. Toothless bounded at Jack out of nowhere, and they went rolling a few meters down the hill, just barely avoiding the acid. But then the changeling whipped her head around to Hiccup, and he flailed with his arms as he jumped to the side to dodge the attack. For a moment, he thought he had triumphed. Then the smell of melting metal reached his nose. His prosthetic.
"Oh, come on,"
he mumbled, and looked up again as the changeling went in for another attack. He couldn't do anything else but set into a frantic crawl. Toothless was running to his aid, but Hiccup could tell he wouldn't make it in time. He heard Jack yell his name, but it sounded very far away as the changeling opened her mouth to fire. Hiccup instinctively covered his face with his arms and just waited for the pain. It never came. The changeling made a strange, almost choked noise. Hiccup opened his eyes and spotted a speck of greens and blues hovering between himself and the dragon. The fairy had come back and was flickering back and forth as if in a panic with an indignant high-pitched yapping. The changeling took half a step back, tilting her head confusedly from side to side. She seemed hesitant to attack, but also hesitant to stand down. Hiccup dared to glance at Jack, as if he might offer some explanation, but he looked just as surprised, if not more. His brows were pulled together, and he was tilting his head sideways in much the same manner as the changeling. Maybe this was the type of dragon that would have suited him, had it been the kind of dragon you could ride. The changeling continued to stare at the fairy, even after she'd stopped reprimanding it. Because that had to be what she was doing. Hiccup didn't need to speak fairy to understand that. Nobody dared move a muscle. And then the changeling's scales shimmered, and the colors blue, green, and yellow poured into them. The fairy's colors. The dragon blinked curiously at her, as if asking for her verdict. Hiccup couldn't see the fairy's face, but she seemed surprised as well. At least the dragon's previous aggression seemed to have been momentarily forgotten. When the fairy spoke again, the changeling gazed steadily at her, not breaking eye contact. In the back of Hiccup's mind, a voice was telling him to warn the fairy that a changeling's eyes could be hypnotizing and that she should be careful. But the changeling only seemed to be listening.
"They're talking?"
Hiccup asked, his voice just loud enough to be heard by Jack, who'd slowly been coming closer to them again, this time undetected, thankfully. Jack shrugged. "Don't speak dragon," he replied in an absent-minded mumble, his eyes still trained on the fairy and the changeling.
"But the baby tooth does?"
"Part of her deal. I'll explain later." Hiccup nodded slowly. He watched the two creatures communicate for a little while longer before he tried getting to his feet. Or foot, rather. Toothless started to come to his aid, but the changeling tensed and hissed the second he moved. The fairy chirped something else, grabbing the dragon's attention for a moment before the changeling slowly looked back to Toothless and Jack. She growled quietly, stood closer to Jamie and the eggs, but when Toothless moved again, she let the two of them pass. Jack came up to Hiccup and let him lean on his shoulder.
"How long can she keep this up?"
Hiccup whispered into Jack's ear.
"I have no idea what to expect right now."
Jack shook his head. "Seems like the dragon is enjoying herself," he said. "And Baby Tooth—" The fairy turned to them at the mention of her name. She nodded then and chirped something at Jack. Jack blinked. She says the changeling is maybe giving us a chance?" he asked, and the fairy nodded. He looked at Hiccup. "You should do your thing now." It took a moment before Hiccup understood what he was talking about.
"I need a new foot first,"
he said. Jack fetched a new prosthetic from the saddle, and once Hiccup had replaced the old, broken one, he shakily stood. He shifted his weight. The changeling was still in the fairy's colors, but her expression had turned a little less playful now that she was looking at Hiccup again. Hiccup took a deep breath and slowly started approaching the changeling again. This time, the changeling remained still. He held his hand up and averted his gaze, and sincerely hoped the fairy actually could speak Dragonese and wasn't just delusional. He felt the soft touch of dragon scales under his palm and sighed with relief. The fairy chirped something, and Hiccup let his hand fall, tentatively looking up at the dragon again. The changeling looked back at him with her big, yellow eyes, and Hiccup smiled.
"That's incredible,"
he muttered, glancing at the fairy. She sent him the smile, and Hiccup awkwardly returned it, but was quick to step back to Toothless.
"Can you ask her nicely if we could get Jamie back?"
Jack suggested. The fairy visibly hesitated, then shook her head. Her spoken reply left a grumpy expression on Jack's face. "Greedy," he grumbled.
"Dragons are known for that,"
Jamie piped up. That didn't sound right to Hiccup, but he let it slide. The fairy continued, and Jack's eyebrows lifted in wonder. "Like you?" he asked. "Are you sure?" Hiccup resisted the urge to yell, "What?" and Jamie seemed to be in the same frustrating position. He decided he'd ask Jack later how exactly he learned to speak fairy, because trying to discern their conversations when he could only hear Jack's side was seriously getting on his nerves. Thankfully, the fairy and Jack seemed to come to an understanding. The latter turned to Hiccup. "She wants to show us something," he said. Hiccup stared back.
"She being—"
"The changeling, yeah. Apparently, Baby Tooth has a certain scent that the changeling has sensed before." Jack shifted uneasily, glancing at the fairy every now and then for confirmation. "A place far from here? The dragon is confused and thinks Baby Tooth must be from there, far away from her nest." He did a weird hand motion where he bent his index and middle finger. Hiccup thought he understood what was going on now, why this changeling seemed to be alone, and why it so quickly latched onto Jamie. Perhaps she was lost. She'd gotten away from her flock somehow, and as she'd taken a liking to the fairy and her pretty colors, she didn't want to see her lost as well. That was as far as he could guess, at least. He wished he had the ability to speak Dragonese. It would have made his life so much easier.
"Okay,"
Hiccup said. Jack looked surprised. "You think we should do it?"
"We need to gain her trust, and if she's right, maybe we'll find more magic. There's just one thing I'm worried about. Why do you sound like you just sort of know what the dragon is saying?"
Jack shrugged. "Baby Tooth's not from here. Her dragon speak is rusty." Hiccup didn't bother to ask him to elaborate.
"Wonderful," he said. "I guess we'll just go then. Hope for the best."
"That's the spirit. Hold on a moment." Jack jogged away and came back with his shoes on. "Now I'm ready." "But, Jamie..." He didn't need to finish the sentence when the changeling grabbed Jamie in her claws. Jamie yelped, but it was just one of surprise, not pain. Jack's expression still darkened dangerously.
"Okay, stay calm,"
Hiccup quickly said.
"She won't hurt him, right, Jamie?"
She's been a very welcoming host," Jamie replied, in a way that didn't make Hiccup envy his position. "How far is this He interrupted himself with another yelp as the changeling took off. Hiccup and Jack quickly jumped onto Toothless and followed them, Jack muttering something about the nerve of this changeling. "The only thing that makes this even slightly forgivable is that Jamie does have this air around him that makes you instantly love him," he said. "If you get me." Hiccup considered this.
"Yeah, I could see that," he agreed. "However, things like that are kind of random. The other changeling I've seen do this adopted Snotlout, and if Snotlout is cute and cuddly, or even just likable, then I'm Stoic the Vast.
Jack laughed, which Hiccup took as a sign that he was beginning to relax, even with Jamie in a wild dragon's clutches. He didn't know if it was because Jack trusted Hiccup to deal with the dragon, or the fairy's ability to communicate with her. He also didn't know why it felt like a competition. What kind of loser was he, feeling jealous of a tiny, tooth-stealing fairy? Who was Jack more likely to fall in love with? That was all beside the point. Hiccup shook his head, glad nobody could read his mind. Unless the fairy could?
Can the fairy read minds?
For a terrifying moment, Jack was silent. What? He laughed. No, of course not. Hiccup let out a quiet breath of relief.
Dunno. Just wondering.
I hope you're not thinking bad things about her.
No, not at all,
Hiccup said, and was fairly sure he wasn't lying. The truth was much more embarrassing.
I was just wondering how she can communicate with you and the dragons.
Baby Truth and I have been friends for a while now, so I gradually started understanding her. I know it's weird. I can't really explain it myself. Maybe it's her magic affecting me. She has the ability to speak every existing language. Dragon speak isn't exactly a language, so I guess that's why she struggles a bit.
Slow down, Hiccup muttered, rubbing his forehead. She struggles with understanding dragons? I'm so envious of that ability you have no idea.
Jack laughed. I don't think she could grant you the ability to understand it, sadly. She did that with Jamie and me. It's why we understand Norse. Hiccup turned around for a moment to check if Jack was joking. He wasn't.
She enchanted you?
Yes, Hiccup, it's all very, very spooky. Hiccup's mind abruptly flashed back to the first conversation he'd had with Jack back in Gothi's hut. The confusion in his expression. No, not just confusion. It had been shock, like he couldn't believe Hiccup was talking to him.
That's why you looked so surprised, he said.
Jack's brows rose.
Oh, did I look surprised?
He asked. There was something off about this voice, almost like he was nervous. Yeah, that was probably it. Hey, what's that Jamie is holding? Hiccup forgot about Jack's strange behavior when he spotted it too. His eyes widened.
Oh, this could have gone in a way worse direction. The guards must be looking out for him, he said. It's a changeling egg. Maybe the changeling is confused and thinks Jamie hatched out of another egg? I can't think of any other reason why she would allow him to hold on to it. He frowned. It could be masking his scent, too. Huh. Jamie isn't stupid.
Jack moaned miserably. Can't even keep one kid safe. Manny, I'm starting to doubt your choices again.
Hey,
Hiccup said, turning around to look at him.
Don't beat yourself up. I already told you the archipelago is dangerous. These things happen.
That's not extremely reassuring, Jack mumbled.
It's not supposed to be,
Hiccup said.
Let's just hope the changeling doesn't realize her mistake at the wrong time. But, hey, think of it like this. Our luck has ironically never been better, the circumstances considered.
Jack smiled. That's the saddest thing I've ever heard, he said. Hiccup responded with a wry smile of his own before turning ahead again. It wasn't until later, thinking back at the conversation, that he wondered who Manny was. The changeling led them over the sea for a long, long time. So long that Hiccup on several occasions started to wonder if she was simply leading them around in circles, waiting for Toothless to exhaust themselves so that she could fly away with Jamie. But they had no choice but to follow. To both Hiccup and Jack's relief, Jamie looked okay each time he caught their eyes. The changeling held him close to her chest, so he wasn't in any danger of getting too cold. He even sent them a thumbs up at one point, so Hiccup could only assume that the changeling was treating him with as much care as she would treat her own actual babies. On top of that, the fairy kept flying back and forth between the two dragons, delivering messages from Jamie and sometimes the changeling. The latter's messages were harder to understand. Dragon speak translated to fairy speak translated to human speak was bound to cause some trouble. But Jack informed him that Jamie was fine, and the dragon was, as far as the fairy understood, in a good mood. It was long dark when Hiccup spotted something in the misty horizon. He was frozen to the bone, his butt and back were aching, and his legs were all pins and needles. His only comfort was Jack, who had long let go of any pride he might have had, hugging Hiccup from behind in search of warmth. Hiccup could hear the faint clatter of his teeth through the wind.
Is that an island?
Hiccup asked. You tell me, Jack said, his voice muffled from pressing his face against Hiccup's back. I think my limbs have frozen in place. Couldn't have moved even if I wanted to. How are you still moving? Hiccup felt a pang of undeserved pride.
I'm a Viking. Can't let the cold be a problem, or we'd all be done for.
It took a lot of concentration to keep his voice from quivering with that aforementioned cold as he spoke.
But I think that's an island over there. I see mountains.
The mountains came into focus as they flew closer, and the island kept expanding. As the fog cleared, the shore kept going, and the mountains kept rising in the distance, towering up from thick, dark, seemingly never-ending woods.
Oh, good.
More trees, Hiccup mumbled. Look at those mountains, Jack whispered, and Hiccup almost jumped from how close he suddenly was to his ear. It definitely looks magical. I have a good feeling about this. Hiccup almost laughed. The change-wing kept flying over the island, and no matter how long they flew, Hiccup couldn't see the ocean on the other side. How huge was this place? The clouds lay low tonight, obscuring the tops of the tallest mountains. The change-wing headed towards an especially tall one and disappeared into the clouds on her way up. Toothless easily followed, and for a few long moments everything was nearly pitch black around them. Hiccup shuddered. It was as if he felt electricity in the air, and he hoped it wouldn't start thundering while they were up here. But electricity wasn't exactly it. It was more like nervous energy, as if the clouds had emotions, and it was coming from all around them, watching them. Are you okay? Jack asked, and Hiccup realized with a start that he'd almost been hyperventilating.
Yeah, I think so, he replied hoarsely. It just feels weird.
Weird how? Hiccup swallowed and shook his head. He didn't want to be asked about this. He didn't want to be some sort of magic detector.
I'm not sure,
he whispered, though he didn't know why he felt the need to be quiet.
It's not the same as with knocking, that's for sure.
They burst out of the clouds, and the starry sky spread out above them. The mountaintop was covered in a layer of snow. Hiccup's mouth went dry.
Is that a bad sign?
He croaked. Maybe, Jack said in a low voice. But I don't feel anything. We should be quick, though, just in case. As they flew to the mountain peak, they saw how little space there was to walk on. With the snow, it was hard to tell where it was safe to step, so Hiccup decided to just stay on Toothless. The change-wing landed on the only part of the mountaintop that was flat, putting Jamie down with surprising gentleness, where something akin to a podium was placed. Flat stones stacked on top of each other. Definitely man-made. Toothless landed on the other side of the podium, eyeing it warily.
It looks ancient,
Hiccup murmured.
But nobody could have gotten up here without dragons. Jack, careful!
Jack had dismounted Toothless and landed in almost knee-deep snow. He stood still for a moment, then sent Hiccup a smile. It's fine, he said, then trudged over to the podium. Strangely enough, it was the only part of the mountaintop that wasn't covered in snow. Jack's brows furrowed when he got closer to it. There's writing here. Hiccup slid off the saddle as well and waddled over. As Jack had said, runes were etched into the stone, old and corroded, but still readable. Tingles went down Hiccup's spine.
It's a place of worship dedicated to the Vanir,
he said. Jack and Jamie only looked at him blankly.
The gods of nature, fertility, and, probably most relevant to us, magic.
He paused, then added,
and the ability to see the future, which, honestly, would have been very helpful right now.
I don't think we need that, Jack mumbled uneasily.
Gods?
Jamie asked.
And this place is magic? Would that mean that the gods are...
He trailed off, glancing at Hiccup. Hiccup blinked.
You're not telling me that you believe in all of this magic stuff without an issue, but you don't believe in the gods?
He asked with an amused smile that quickly started to wane when they both looked guilty of just that. He shook his head.
You're weird. This place does feel, magic, though, I think. Maybe.
The fairy chirped and nodded. Great, Jack said, and unlatched the satchel around his waist. And the gods aren't evil, right?
They're...
Hiccup hesitated, shifting his weight. The stories he'd heard about the gods didn't exactly make them seem like the best, nor the brightest, people sometimes, but it didn't feel safe to insinuate that they were anything other than great. He gestured vaguely.
It should be fine. Besides, evil magic hasn't stopped you before.
Jack shrugged in response and poured the crystals onto the podium. Just as he did, Jamie made a surprised noise. Everyone present turned their eyes to him, and Hiccup expected the worst. But Jamie just stared at the egg in his hands.
"Oh, no, put it down," Hiccup yelled. "It's gonna explode."
Jamie put the egg down as quickly and gingerly as he could and backed away. The changeling was too enraptured by the twitching and rocking of the egg to notice him back away straight into Hiccup, and Hiccup quickly grabbed both him and Jack's arms and pulled them back to Toothless. The egg exploded just as Toothless covered them with a wing. They waited for a few seconds before peeking out at it. A baby changeling crawled shakily around in the snow, and its mother bent her head down to nudge it. The baby made a squeaky version of a changeling's growl. Hiccup found himself smiling. "Wow," Jamie whispered. The adult changeling turned her eyes to him, and he froze. "Whoops." Jack gripped his staff tightly. "She's not getting you back," he hissed, and Hiccup wondered what he expected to do with that staff against the dragon, especially now that he knew the thing with Fangong had been due to the fairy's intervention. "Wait," Hiccup said, placing a hand on Jack's shoulder. "Jamie, go to her." Jack shot him a look. "Why?" The changeling gave a low growl, but it didn't sound hostile. It was soft and quiet. Sad.
"I think she's realized the misunderstanding now," Hiccup said. "That's bad, though, isn't it?" Jamie asked in a small voice. "No, she's trying to say goodbye."
Jamie's eyes widened. He looked from Hiccup to the changeling, who still wasn't moving, though she was watching Jamie steadily. The baby changeling stood close to her chest, looking about as confused as the rest of them. Then Jamie got to his feet and started taking slow steps towards the two changewings. Hiccup kept his eyes on the changeling, enraptured by the strange moment. Maybe Jack really had been onto something when he said that about Jamie giving off a certain aura that made people, or dragons, instantly love him. The only thing that distracted him was, when Jamie stepped closer to the changeling and she lowered her head to get on his eye level, Jack's breath hitched nervously and his hand wrapped around Hiccup's. Jamie put his hand on the changeling's snout without a problem, and the changeling gently nudged him, making a small, almost purring noise. Hiccup had never seen a changeling act like this. Even if she had been acting a bit off since the beginning, mistaking a human for a baby dragon and all, seeing this still made chills go down Hiccup's back. Then the changeling stepped away. The newly hatched dragon would not be able to fly yet, so the changeling lowered herself to let her child climb onto her back. She offered the rest of them a long look, and once again the fairy's colors ran across her scales for only a moment before it turned back to red. Then she took off and disappeared into the clouds. Jamie turned around, his eyes round and slightly misty. He sniffled. "Will we see her again?" Jack walked over to him and hugged him. "Maybe," he said, though the chances were slim. When they separated, he turned to the podium where the crystals were still spread out. He wrapped his hand in his cloak and put the crystals back in the satchel. "We should find somewhere a little warmer to see if it worked." Hiccup nodded. As Jamie walked over to Toothless, he couldn't help but ruffle his hair lightly, sending him a bright smile.
"I'm getting the feeling you're a natural at dragon training, Jamie," he said.
Despite Jamie's blues from being separated from his one-day adoptive dragon mother, that still made him grin, and he shrugged modestly.
"I don't think that counts as dragon training, to be honest," he mumbled.
They flew down from the creepy mountain top, and as they descended towards the ground, the buzzing feeling in the air subsided, and Hiccup no longer felt like they were being observed. He wondered why it had felt different from the other times he'd felt watched, like on what Jack and Jamie had dubbed Jotun Island, or that other tiny island. The fact that it had been a worshipping site for the Vanir didn't make him any less nervous. It was like it insinuated they'd been watched by the gods themselves, and Hiccup wasn't confident enough to want to bask in any sort of divine limelight. Toothless soared along the mountain wall near the ground, looking for a cave or a nook to take shelter in. They weren't as lucky this time, and ended up landing near the base of the mountain. At least the trees offered a tiny bit of security. It wouldn't be easy to spot them for any potential predators. At the same time, it wouldn't be easy for them to spot any approaching enemies either. After they'd gathered firewood and got the fire started, they sat down against a fallen tree trunk and did their best to thaw their frozen limbs. Jamie sat closer to Jack than usual, seeming uncharacteristically quiet. Thankfully, he seemed more thoughtful than sad, which was something Hiccup understood wholeheartedly. He made a mental promise to lift his spirits by teaching him more about riding dragons in the morning. Jack emptied the satchel again. As he looked at the crystals, the bags under his eyes seemed to darken, and he sighed deeply. Wonder what it'll be this time, he muttered. He put a hand on Jamie's back and smiled a tired, lopsided smile. You ready? Yeah, Jamie replied in a soft voice. He took a deep breath, puffed up his chest, and nodded. Yes, he then said, this time with resolution. He, Jack, and the fairy repeated the same process as before. Hiccup could only watch as they all passed out in turn and didn't feel any less disturbed than he did the first time he'd witnessed it. He shared a look with Toothless.
How did we end up here?
He asked. Toothless made a noise that sounded like an audible shrug, then padded over to the fire and lay down, so that Hiccup could prop Jack and Jamie up against him. When that was done, he gently placed the fairy in the crook of Jack's neck, where she usually nestled up, carefully tilting Jack's head to the side to give her space, hopefully without dooming Jack to any neck pain when he woke up. It was eerie how Hiccup could jostle them around as much as he wanted without waking them. Jack's face was completely still. Only his chest rose and fell in a slow, steady rhythm. His lips were slightly parted, and Hiccup could see his breath coming out as mist. The fern pattern was almost invisible in the flickering firelight. Hair fell into Jack's eyes, and Hiccup brushed it away before he could stop himself. He pulled his hand back and dragged it down his face instead, groaning in frustration and embarrassment. He could not have chosen a worse time to have a crush. Jack was also high on the list of people that would be unwise to develop feelings for. Not because he was untrustworthy or undeserving of that kind of affection, of course. Jack was intriguing in a way Hiccup had never seen in any other person before. And he was brave and kind and funny and had a heart that sometimes seemed too big for his own good, and he was going away. When all of this was over, there was a good chance Hiccup would never see him again. Why his brain had thought it a fun idea to develop feelings for someone he knew he'd have to say goodbye to eventually was beyond him. Toothless crooned softly, his tail coming to brush against Hiccup's leg. Hiccup sent him a grateful smile. Then he noticed how quickly the fire was devouring the wood they'd collected and got to his feet.
Watch over them. I'll be right back.
Maybe going into the dark forest to collect wood alone was a bad idea, but it seemed somehow better than just to sit there and stare longingly at Jack's sleeping face. At this point, he was no better than the tooth fairies he'd been criticizing. It was hard to find any twigs and broken branches that would actually keep the fire alive, and Hiccup ventured a little further than he'd intended. And maybe he did it a little bit on purpose, because after the day that they'd had, from fighting evil snow eagles to maybe or maybe not being watched by the Vanires themselves, he needed a little time to himself to clear his mind. He wasn't sure how long he'd been walking around. Not too long, he was pretty sure, when he heard the sound of a twig snapping. He whipped around and grabbed Inferno. It's just me. Hiccup exhaled.
Jack, a warning would be appreciated.
Jack stepped a little closer, his smile apologetic. Sorry, I wasn't sure if it was you. His voice sounded a bit hoarse, almost as if he'd been crying.
Did something happen?
Hiccup asked, taking a tentative step closer. He suddenly felt guilty for not being there while they slept. It wasn't the first time Jack had woken up upset from his visions.
I didn't expect you to wake up so fast.
Jack shook his head. Just tired, he said, but folded his hands. Was he nervous?
Is Jamie still at the camp?
Hiccup asked, shifting his weight. Now he felt nervous. Why was Jack acting so weird? Was he acting weird, or was Hiccup just imagining it? Whatever you do, he told himself sternly, don't get any ideas. Yes, Jack said. What are you doing out here?
Collecting wood. Is the fire still alive?
Jack nodded. Barely. We should probably head back. Hiccup nodded too, though hesitantly. He studied Jack and the way his eyes kept shifting, as if there was something on his mind that needed to get out. Or maybe the darkness was just making him nervous. There wasn't any snow on the ground here, but maybe the Snow Queen still had some powers here with the snowy mountaintops. Not that that wasn't the case for most of the islands they'd visited.
How's your face?
Hiccup asked. Jack blinked. What?
The mark?
Hiccup tapped his own temple.
Still nothing?
Oh, no, it's fine. Hiccup frowned.
Jack, are you sure you're all right?
He asked, walking a few steps closer to him again. He weighed his words, wondering what would be too much or too little to say. He didn't even know if Jack truly was upset or not. It was different from when he'd caught him yelling at the moon. At least Jack had made it quite obvious that he'd been upset back then. But then again, there was little reason for why he would come all this way out to the woods, if not to have a private word, right?
If there's something you want to talk about, I'm all ears. You know that, right?
Hiccup tried for a smile, glad that the darkness masked the nervousness that was probably clear as day on his face. Jack gave a soft laugh. He opened his mouth as if to say something, then closed it again. He studied Hiccup silently for just long enough to make Hiccup feel sheepish about it. Then he took a step closer. "I know," he said, and Hiccup could barely discern his face shifting into a warm smile. I don't know, it's strange." Hiccup's mouth felt a bit dry.
"What is?"
"This," Jack said with a small shrug. "I've been thinking about where we are and what will happen and all, how we got here, where we will be tomorrow. So much has happened in just one day." Hiccup huffed.
"Yeah, I was just thinking the same thing," he mumbled. "Is that a bad thing?"
"I'm not sure," Jack admitted. He gave a shaky sigh. "I guess it's good, in a way, but in another, not so much." He went quiet. Hiccup felt as if he should fill the silence, but didn't know what to fill it with. Then Jack looked up at him, and his mouth was opening and closing, like it was struggling with the same problem. "Do you think we'll get through this alive?" That wasn't what Hiccup thought he was going to say. Not that he knew what he'd expected either.
"For sure,"
Hiccup said with a nod.
"We will."
"But what if we don't?" Jack said. "What about the others, back on Burke?"
"Jack, we've already been through this," Hiccup sighed. "I want to help you. I don't care about the risks or the weird magic. Trust me, if it's for you—"
He faltered when he realized how dangerously sentimental those words were. This definitely counted as too much, but the words were already out.
If it's for you, none of that matters. No knocker, no fairies, and no snow queens. Besides, we all saw how well you dealt with that changeling today. You need me. Although I guess the fairy was the one who placated her in the end."
The last part came out as a quiet, somewhat pouty mumble. Jack's face was blank. Then he smiled slowly. "Those are some big words," he commented. Hiccup felt himself blush.
"Yeah, well, I have to compensate for my otherwise scrawny nature,"
he explained lamely. Jack's lips pressed together like he was holding back a laugh. He took another step closer to Hiccup, which at this point was almost uncomfortably close. Hiccup found himself holding his breath. "No ideas," he reminded himself.
"That's a perfectly reasonable explanation for this. Get your head out of the clouds, Hiccup."
"The thing is," Jack started. His gaze was lowered to Hiccup's chest, like he was afraid to meet his eyes. Hiccup wondered if his heart was beating as fast as his own right now. The thing is, I think I like this, being here, with you." Hiccup suddenly felt paralyzed.
Oh,
he said smartly. "Is that strange?"
No, it's fine."
Hiccup closed his eyes for a moment, running this conversation through his mind. Was what he thought was happening really happening right now? Was Jack saying what it sounded like he was saying? Gods, he needed to say something more in reply.
"I mean, it's great."
It was just that it all felt so out of the blue. He didn't feel the way he expected that he would feel in the situation. Which was probably why the next words coming out of his mouth was something as lame as,
"You probably have to have a conversation about it with the fairy, though. I mean," Hiccup smiled sheepishly, "what was her name again?"
Jack looked up. He let out a small chuckle. "I'm sure it will sort itself out. I'll ask about it once we get back." Hiccup swallowed. The warmish feeling in his chest suddenly dispersed, and in its place came a slow, creeping cold. A few things surfaced in his mind. Things that he'd registered subconsciously, but had been too distracted to really consider. 1. Jack was not carrying a staff. 2. Jack hadn't corrected him earlier when he'd referred to Baby Tooth as the fairy. And 3. Jack had never shown any signs that what Hiccup felt for him was mutual. Hiccup ignited Inferno. It burst into flame, and Jack jolted away and sent him a frightened look. Hiccup ignored it and just stepped closer, driving Jack up against a tree.
"What are you doing?"
Jack hissed in alarm.
"What?" Hiccup replied in a low voice. "Is my name."
Jack's eyes were wide. He shook his head.
"Stop this." "Answer the question. It's pretty simple."
But Jack just continued to stare. Hiccup ignored the helpless, betrayed look on his face and just pushed the blade closer to his chest. And then he smiled. But it wasn't his smile. This smile was flat, almost lifeless. The puppeteer had given up on trying to seem authentic. This wasn't Jack.
"You must know each other better than I thought,"
Not Jack said, now in a whispery voice.
"Who are you?"
Hiccup demanded.
"Who am I? Why, you just mentioned me."
The corner of Not Jack's mouth twitched upwards. "As an unimportant problem in the face of your selfless, noble bravery. You Burkians always were too stubborn to give up when you should." The cold spread from Hiccup's chest to the rest of his body. He felt his hands start to shake. His voice came out as a whisper.
"You're the Snow Queen."
The Snow Queen smiled with Jack's face. "Good, good," she said, and it almost sounded like she meant it. "And now, my dear, comes the part where you ask me, what have you done with my friends?"